Sensei Michelle and I were in the Keys earlier this week. I know. I'm still there. Part of me is still there. But on Monday we went snorkeling, and I've been snorkeling and scuba diving and stuff in the Keys a bunch of times. And you always want to go see the Christ of the Abyss statue. You've probably heard of that. It's about an 8-foot statue of Jesus under about 25 feet of water. And every time I've been there, I don't know how many dozen times, we've gone out on boats, and it's always been either too heavy current or bad visibility or something like that there. And so I wasn't even thinking about it when we got there, but I saw that there was a sign behind where you check in to go out on the boats from Penny Camp Park. And there was a sign that said, sorry, can't go to Christ of the Abyss because currents are too bad and visibility's bad. I didn't even think about it. And then on the boat, the captain's talking about where we're going and everything, and he says we can't go to Christ of the Deep because, current, et cetera, et cetera. And then he anchors, and we're getting our snorkels and stuff out and getting ready to go into the water, and he goes, oh, by the way, says, that other boat over there, they radioed me, there's no current here. So right behind there, if you go that way, just a few yards, there's Christ of the Abyss. So for the first time in my life, I was able to snorkel out there and see that. So if you don't know what this is, I mean, it was put there in, I think, 1965, and it's one of 3 bronze casting of a statue by an Italian sculptor. And it's there as a memorial to sailors that were lost at sea originally, but it's one of those places that draws a lot of people. And as I was floating over it, it occurred to me that, we tend to look up at the heavens to find the divine. And there it was right under the surface of the water, and we couldn't see it because we didn't know it was there. Kind of like that chalice reading that Rita used earlier. So I've been thinking a lot lately about the concept of divinity. I've been asked questions a lot about Buddhism and its relationship to the divine, and is it part of the practice, and if so, what is it, and that sort of thing. This is not a short conversation, but it's a good question. It's an important question. And so what I thought I would try to do today is give you some things to work with so you can explore this on your own. So a lot of Americans who come to Buddhism are humanistic. And by that I mean looking for a path of practice that's helpful on human terms, that recognizes the value of humanity, recognizes human agency, puts critical thinking above dogma, has a here and now focus, or at least a human value rather than supernatural, transcendental, and that sort of thing. And so Buddhism has a side that is very much that way, but there are some facets to that gem that reflect a little bit differently. There's a lot of confusions and misperceptions about Buddhism, so we can kind of clear up a couple of those. People ask me, is Buddha a god? And that's not a yes or no question. Seems like it would be, but it kind of depends on who you ask. So there was a human being who lived 2,500 years ago, just a human being just like us, did things people like us can do, realized something that we can realize. However, that idea evolved over time, and I'll go into that a little bit more. I also, somebody emailed me and talked about how we bow to idols. So, if you go into any Buddhist temple, there's a statue at the front, people face in that direction and bow. But recently I did an interfaith service at Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church, and I noticed that there was a big crucifix over the stage, and people facing at it, putting their hands together and stuff like that. So in both cases, these are symbols of something that we want to touch with our hearts. I think that's a good way of putting that. So in Buddhism, there's something that we want to realize, and the statue of the Buddha is a representation of that. in Christianity is a representation of the sacrifice that was made on the behalf of Christians. And this is a way to approach that salvation. So there's this thing in religious studies called soteriology, which is salvation theory. It's kind of what's the objective of a religion and how is that objective achieved? So there's this idea that I'll hear said once in a while that all paths lead up the same mountain. And I don't really completely agree with this. I think that there are different mountains and different paths. But I would say, if you want to stick with that metaphor, that all paths lead out of the same valley. Right? There's this idea in the Judeo-Christian tradition of, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. So the valley of human suffering, the valley of stress and affliction, and this is what we're trying to transcend. And I think all religions, in some way or another, try to move out of that valley. So in Christianity, that comes from deliverance from sin and its consequences through the death and resurrection, more or less, depending on who you're talking to. In Judaism, God redeems followers from their various exiles, including their final exile, which people will be redeemed and live with God. So redemption in that case is through one's own actions, following the Ten Commandments and things like that. So in Buddhism, the original teaching was that to break free of this valley, this cycle of suffering, samsara, the cycle of coming and going, that there was a path of practice. So, and that the freedom from that is nirvana, which is an indescribable state of non-returning, basically, of extinguishing the fires of stress and affliction, so there's no more coming back. So the original teaching of the Buddha is indeed very humanistic. There are 4 truths. If you're born, you're going to encounter difficulties. Those difficulties have cause. That cause is misunderstanding. And the way out of that is a path. And the path is the Noble Eightfold Path, which you could sum up as living compassionately, developing wisdom, training your mind. And so this is essentially very humanistic. And you find that if you practice this, you get rewards in this life. You experience less stress and a greater sort of awareness of your true self. And if you want to take it a little farther, it gets you out of the cycle of coming and going that the ancient Indians believed, that rebirth kept bringing us back to. However, there were deities in Buddhism, even in the Buddha's time. But they're not, there's no eternal heaven and hell. There are heavens and hells, a bunch of, like 36 levels of existence. And beings can be born in, you can achieve deva status, which is kind of like being an angel. But whatever karma brings you into that form is going to eventually come to an end. And when that happens, that form is going to come to an end. And the deities in early Buddhism are not really there to help you. They're not a path to salvation. They just happen to have been born into a slightly different realm than you did. So, we don't really need to worry about these states and whether or not they exist. The universal point is that unless we break free of the things that keep bringing us back to existence, we're doomed to continue it. So, there are some exceptions to this as we progress, as Buddhism evolved after the Buddha's time. So the first ideal was the ideal that we practice and we become liberated ourselves. As Buddhism spread, a different objective came into being. We don't want to become, we don't want to attain nirvana ourselves. We want to stick around to help others. It was seen as selfish to seek liberation for yourself. And so now the ideal is to become a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva can still be around, to be called upon for help. And then that kind of leads to the development of the idea of Pure Lands. If you become completely purified and completely enlightened, and you die, and you stick around, where do you go? You don't come back here because there's suffering here. So you're reborn in a land that's free of those things. In a land that's really basically a construction of your own mind. So, when most Americans think of the divine, they probably think of some sort of a supernatural force, some force of nature maybe that's behind unpredictable events and that kind of thing. But you could say that goodness, kindness, things like that, when they happen as a result of a spiritual search, are reflections of the divine. So in the Abrahamic traditions, the presence of God appears in the actions of the faithful, for instance. And we have very similar ideas of this in the idea of the bodies of the Buddha. In the Mahayana tradition, the Buddha is said to have 3 different bodies that appear in different forms. There's the historical body, a blissful body, and a dharma body. So there's this idea that this is where the idea comes from that the Buddha is possibly a god or is somehow divine. That's where this comes in. But the living presence of the Buddha in any of these cases depends on us to be manifest. So as you know, there was a human being named Gautama who lived in northern India, spent several years doing religious practices, achieved enlightenment, became a Buddha, and then taught others so that his spiritual path is available to us today. So that body, the body of a human being that lived 2,500 years ago, is called the Nirmana Kaya. The word Kaya means body. And so this is the physical body of the historical Buddha. Because of that physical body, the whole path of practice exists. So the second body is the Sambhoga Kaya. You don't have to remember these. I'm not going to give an example. This is the body of bodhisattvas. If you become fully enlightened and you pass away, but you stick around, you have this sort of bliss body. It's kind of a body of light. It's very subtle, doesn't have form. So where this can be useful is in an idea like compassion. In Mahayana Buddhism, one of the key bodhisattvas is Avalokiteshvara. This is not a historical figure. There was no person no person that lived and died and became this bodhisattva. This is the embodiment of compassion itself. But the idea mythically is that these appear in Pure Lands. And the Pure Lands are created by the mind of Buddhas. So this is kind of an interesting thing to explore when we get to the third body of the Buddha, which is the Dharmakaya. Christianity has this sort of Sambhogakaya idea too. There are saints, right? In some Christian schools, people pray to saints and that sort of thing. And so you might say that if you call on a saint, you're calling on help from its Sambhogakaya. That would be a kind of a comparable idea. This is a subtle body made from the saint's compassion, or their love, or their protectiveness, or so on. This is not just a metaphor, I think, for a lot of people. There are people who really feel the presence of these saints very strongly. And Buddhists can feel very connected to Avalokiteshvara or to Amitabha, who's the Buddha that we call on in Pure Land Buddhism. The third body of the Buddha is the Dharmakaya. And this is the body of the Dharma. So this word Dharma is kind of interesting. Usually when we use the word Dharma, we're talking about the teachings of the Buddha. But it also refers to the realization of the teachings. In other words, the results. You practice until you reach the fruit of the practice. That's also Dharma. Dharma also means absolute truth. So the Dharma body is truth itself. There's a term we use, the inconceivable body of the Buddha. This is the reality of enlightenment out of which Buddhas arise and to which they return. So the physical, historical Buddha is sort of like an incarnation of the Dharma body. So this is a little confusing, but there's a discourse where the Buddha is talking to someone who was very ill and went to see him, And he was just about to die, and the Buddha said, well, do you have any regrets? And he says, yes, I've wanted to see you for a long time, but I was too ill to do so. And so he regretted that he hadn't managed to make the trip to see the Buddha sooner. The Buddha comforts him. He says, enough. Why do you want to see this body? Whoever sees the Dharma sees me. Whoever sees me sees the Dharma. So, nothing originates on its own. People who become Buddhists have to arise out of something too. The possibility of an awakening arises out of that truth. So that body, the body of truth, is present in all beings. So this is what we call Buddha nature, the seed of enlightenment. So while you might say that the historical body of the Buddha is or was real in the conventional sense, the others have this reality that kind of works in the absolute sense. They're basically tools that the mind uses to approach reality, but not really reality itself. All of these are to be seen as one with the practitioner. So the founder of Rinzai Zen once said, the pure light of your own heart is at this instant the Dharmakaya Buddha. The pure light of your heart at this instant is the Dharmakaya Buddha. The non-differentiating light, that's the light that doesn't judge others, that doesn't judge people in situations as good or bad, but is able to accept whatever arises. That's the Sambhogakaya Buddha. The non-discriminating light of your own heart is the Nirmanakaya Buddha. This trinity of the Buddha's body is none other than here before your eyes, listening to me expounding the Dharma. So this right here, this moment, is the trinity of the Buddha's bodies. Now, how can you use that, right, in your own spiritual progress? So when we think of something like the divine, we might think of something like walking on water. But Thich Nhat Hanh said something once. He said that the greatest miracle is not the ability to walk on water, it's the ability to walk on earth. The divine, the great truth, the miracle of existence is under our feet, in front of our eyes, right in our hearts, or just underwater. So we can experience this miracle in a number of ways. One of the quickest is just to be present to it. That takes a lot of practice. But if you can just kind of open up to that reality, it's there. Zen Master Dogen, who founded the Soto School of Japanese Zen, said very famously, it's probably his most famous quote, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things of the universe. We've all probably had this moment where we've forgotten the self. We just maybe didn't recognize what it was. Musicians will experience this sometimes when you start to feel like the music is playing you. Or anything that you do where you really feel immersed in it and it takes over and you forget you. So you can free fall through existence. That's kind of that forgetting the self. As long as we're clinging to our ego, we can't really know our awakened selves. So to forget the self is to discover the path to the divine. So what does this word mean, divine? I don't know. Not only do I not know, I don't want to know. I hope I never get this feeling that I know the answer to that question. Because in my experience, people who claim to know the answer to that probably don't really even understand the question very well. So when the Buddha talked about this, he was asked about this a number of times. And there's one fairly famous situation. There's a sutra called the Kalama Sutta. There's this group of people, the Kalamas, they were a clan in northern India. And then had a bunch of teachers come by, and everyone was very much adamant that they knew the answer to everything, and so they would give a teaching about, whether or not there was life after death, and what the nature of reality was, and all these kind of things, and they were all sure that they were the right ones. And then they would leave, and the next guy would come in, and he would give a teaching completely contradicting the previous guy, but he's absolutely sure that he's right, and he knows all the answers and all that kind of stuff. And so the columnists came to the Buddha and said, how can we tell what's true? And the Buddha said, Well, first of all, don't go by traditions. Don't go by dogma. Don't go by the idea, this is our teacher, all those kinds of things. Don't go by what people tell you you should believe in. You have to realize the truth for yourself. And then, and this doesn't mean throw out the baby with the bathwater. Traditions can be important and all of that kind of stuff. I think they're very useful, but they're not realities. They're what we say in Zen are fingers pointing at the moon, but not the moon itself. So then he said, there are some things you need to let go of. Greed, hatred, delusion, that sort of thing. And then you can start seeing more clearly. This idea is not unique to Buddhism. I mentioned Spong, and Merton had some similar ideas. He once said that the question of the divine was more important than the answer. He said there's only one problem on which my existence, my peace and happiness depend, and that's to discover myself in discovering God. If I find God, I will find myself, and if I find myself, I will find God. Bishop Spong said something in that I quoted earlier. He said, existence is a category that makes sense only in time and space. He said, for me, believing in God is about believing in life, believing in love, even believing in air. I assume the reality, and then I seek to walk into the meaning of that assumption. This is an interesting idea, walking into the meaning of this assumption. So in Buddhism, the ultimate expression of the divine is the Dharmakaya, the body of the Buddha. That's Buddha nature that pervades the whole universe, including here and now. Spong and Merton both mentioned this principle, talking about the idea that the divine penetrates everything and is encapsulated by everything. This is the inconceivable body of the Buddha. But how do we do this? How do we step into this space that we assume with the divine? Well, when the Buddha talked to the colonists, he told them, after you abandon greed and hatred and delusion, you can develop the divine mind. There's the term Brahma. Brahma is the highest level of gods in Indian cosmology, and Vihara, dwelling place. So you can dwell in this high place, the Brahma Viharas. You did it earlier when I guided you with the meditation. He said, one who's a disciple of the Noble Ones pervades above, below, and all around the all-encompassing cosmos with an awareness imbued with goodwill, abundant, expansive, free from hostility, free from ill will. So when you work on developing that capacity to love without regard, without discrimination, boundlessly, that is stepping into that space of the divine. And once you can love, then you can be compassionate. If you want everyone to do well, then you want everyone to be free from suffering. Then you can be grateful for everything. And then you can recognize that no matter what happens, stillness is the natural state. So, if you want to experience the divine, start by experiencing love. Merton said that to say that I'm made in the image of God is to say that love is the reason for my existence. For God is love. Love is my true identity. Selflessness is my true self. Love is my true character. Love is my name. So I'd like to give you just a moment of silence before the benediction.